Good day, sir, and good day, everyone. We are the Group 4, and we are here to present to you the topic urinary system and fluid balance. So, what is urinary system? The urinary system is the major excretory of the body. Some organs in other systems also eliminate waste, but they are not able to compensate in case of kidney failure. The urinary system consists of two kidneys, which is the two ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. The major function of the urinary system is excretion, which controls the composition and volume of the body. Each kidney's waste products are carried by ureter to a single urinary bladder. The waste is emptied from the urinary bladder by the urethra. The kidneys each filter a large volume of blood. Waste from the blood are collected and form urine. The urine consists of excess water, excess ions, metabolic waste including the protein byproduct urea, and toxic substances. Facts about kidney. The kidney filters about 180 liters of blood plasma daily, and 1.5 liters of urine is formed daily to remove waste products. The kidney function includes excretion, regulation of blood volume and pressure, regulation of the concentration of solutes in the blood, regulation of the extracellular fluid pH, regulation of the red blood cell synthesis, and regulation of the vitamin D synthesis. Excretion. The kidneys remove waste products from the blood. Most of the waste products are metabolic byproducts of cell metabolism. Other waste products are substances absorbed from the intestine. Many waste products are toxic. Organs such as the skin, liver, lungs, and intestines eliminate some of these waste products. However, if the kidneys fail to function, these organs cannot remove sufficient waste to maintain homeostasis. Next is regulation of blood volume and pressure. The kidneys play a major role in controlling the extracellular fluid volume in the body. The kidneys can produce either a large volume of diluted urine or a small volume of concentrated urine, depending on the hydration level of the body. Through urine production, the kidneys regulate blood volume and blood pressure. Next is regulation of the concentration of solutes in the blood. The kidneys help regulate the concentration of the major molecules and ions, such as glucose, sodium, chlorine, potassium ion, calcium ion, bicarbonate ion, and hydrogen phosphate. Next, regulation of extracellular fluid pH. The kidneys excrete variable amounts of hydrogen ion to help regulate extracellular fluid pH. Next is regulation of red blood cell synthesis. The kidneys secrete a hormone, erythropoietin, which regulates the synthesis of red blood cells in the bone marrow. Last is regulation of vitamin D synthesis. The kidneys play an important role in controlling blood levels of calcium ion by regulating the synthesis of vitamin D.
So let us now proceed to the anatomy of the kidney. But before that, let us first define what is kidney, its function in our body, and its relation to the urinary system. Kidneys are two reddish-brown bean-shaped organs that can be found in vertebrates. Each kidney is about 4 or 5 inches long, or the size of a large fist. It has significant function in our body. They are responsible in the regulation of body water, removal of liquid waste, and control blood pressure. The kidneys are located behind the peritoneum and are located on each side of the vertebral column. They are underneath our body's rib cage. That's why, when there are pain in our kidneys, we can feel it in the middle to the upper back. So let us now tackle the internal and external anatomy of the kidneys. Internally, kidneys have two major regions. The outer cortex, also known as the renal cortex, which contains blood vessel connected to the nephrons. And the other region is called as inner medulla or renal medulla. It is the inner region of the kidney that is responsible for the regulation of the body water. Here is the longitudinal section of the kidney. In this part, I will be discussing the part of the kidney just like in the previous slide, both internally and externally, including their main functions. First, Renal pyramids are located between the renal cortex and medulla. Its function is to transport urine from the outer part of the kidney. A calyx is the extension of renal pelvis. It channels urine from the renal pyramids to renal pelvis. Renal pelvis is a large panel in the innermost part of the kidney, where it serves as the pathway for fluid on its way to the bladder. Renal capsule is a thin but tough outer membrane that surrounds the kidney. Renal column's main function is to divide the kidney into several lobes in order to provide a supportive framework for vessels that enter and exit the cortex. The hilum is the concave part of the kidney where blood vessels and nerves enter and exit the kidney. Renal artery is a pair of arteries that branch off of the aorta, bringing waste-filled blood into the kidney for filtering. It carries a large volume of blood from the heart to the kidney. They give rise to several branches. It includes interlobar arteries, arcuate arteries, interlobular arteries, apparent arterioles, and peritubular capillaries. There is a renal veins in each kidney. They branch up the interior vena cava and drain oxygen-depleted blood from the kidneys, or they remove the filtered blood from the kidneys to the inferior vena cava. Ureter are narrow tubes that carries urine from the renal pelvis and transport it to the bladder. Nephron is the functional unit of our kidney, and each of our kidney has approximately 1.3 million nephrons. It consists of different components such as renal corpuscle, proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle, and distal convoluted tubule. First is renal corpuscle. It is a blood filtering unit of kidneys where it consists of two, the Bowman capsule and the glomerulus. The Bowman capsule performs the first step in the filtration of blood to form urine, while glomerulus is a network of capillaries located at the beginning of nephron in the kidney. Second, the proximal convoluted tubule lies between the Bowman's capsule and the loop of Henle. Its function is to reabsorb most of required substances from the filtrate. Next is the loop of Henle. Its function is in the recovery of water and sodium chloride from urine. Each loop of Henle consists of two regions, the descending limb and ascending limb. The thin descending limb is permeable to water, while on the other hand, ascending limb is impermeable to water. And last, the distal convoluted tubule is a nephron segment that helps in the regulation of extracellular fluid volume. There are two types of nephrons, the juxtamedullary nephrons and the cortical nephrons. The juxtamedullary nephron is a functional unit of kidney with a long loop of Henle extending deep into the renal medulla. Its function is to concentrate or dilute urine. On the other hand, cortical nephron is a functional unit of kidney with a short loop of Henle that penetrates the outer renal medulla. It performs excretory and regulatory function. Filtration membrane is located between the glomerulus and Bowman's capsule. Its function is to prevent the passage of the majority of the protein to the urine. It consists of endothelium of the glomerular capillaries, the podocytes, and the basement membrane.
I am here to discuss to you how urine are produced. But first, let us identify what is urine. Urine is a collection of substances that the body does not need, and it is produced in our kidney through cleaning our blood. Urine consists of mainly water, dissolved waste products such as urea, creatinine, as well as excess ions. So, how does urine produce? There are three main steps of urine formation. These are glomerular filtration, tubular absorption, and tubular secretion. But first, let us identify what happens in the glomerular filtration. Note that the glomerular filtration depends on a balance between the forces that favor filtration and those that oppose it. These forces are glomerular capillary pressure, which move fluid from the blood into the Bowman's capsule, capsular pressure, which moves the fluid from the Bowman's capsule into the blood, colloid osmotic pressure, which moves fluid from the Bowman capsule into the blood by osmosis, and lastly, the filtration pressure, which is equal to the glomerular capillary pressure minus the capsular and colloid osmotic pressure. Moving on, here we have our renal corpuscle, where glomerular filtration happens. One part of the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus, which is basically a network of capillaries. The other part is the surrounding Bowman's capsule. Blood flows through the glomerulus from the afferent arteriole to the efferent arteriole, and as this occurs, components of the blood are filtered out. The fluid that enters the Bowman capsule is called the glomerular filtrate. However, the filtration membrane allows some substances but not others to pass from the blood into the Bowman's capsule. Water and small solutes readily pass through the openings of the filtration membrane, but blood cells and most proteins, which are too large, do not enter the Bowman's capsule. Consequently, the filter contains no cell and little protein. Glomerular filtration rate is the total amount of filtrate formed by all the renal corpuscles in both kidneys per minute. Remember that in a healthy person, the total filtrate volume amounts to 180 liters a day, but only 1% or less of the filtrate becomes urine because most of the filtrate is reabsorbed. The filtration pressure is influenced by three factors: the blood pressure in the glomerular capillaries, the blood protein concentration, and the pressure in the Bowman's capsule. Remember that glomerular capillary blood pressure is normally higher than blood pressure in most other capillaries. The filtration pressure increases if the glomerular capillary blood pressure increases, and then vice versa. An increase in blood protein concentration encourages the movement of water by osmosis back into the glomerular capillaries and therefore reduces the overall filtration pressure. On the other hand, a decrease in blood protein concentration inhibits the movement of water by osmosis back into the glomerular capillaries, which increases the overall filtration membrane. Now, let's proceed to the step 2 of our urine formation, which is the tubular reabsorption. Before we start, let us have a brief definition of reabsorption. Reabsorption is the movement of water and solutes from the nephron tubule back into the circulation. Remember that 99% of filtrate is reabsorbed and re-enters circulation. Now, here we have our nephron. As the blood exits in the efferent arteriole, it enters the vasa rectum, which are basically a capillaries which follows the tube of the nephron. It allows the reabsorption of things back into the circulation. The tubule of the nephron has few sections. After the Bowman's capsule, we have the proximal convoluted tubules, the loop of Henle, the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct. These sections are responsible for reabsorption of different electrolytes and substances as well as water. Now, this section may absorb the same things but in varying amounts. Let us focus first on the reabsorption of substances, beginning with the proximal convoluted tubules. In proximal convoluted tubule, we get the reabsorption of glucose, amino acids, urea, sodium, potassium, phosphate, calcium, magnesium, as well as water. It is permeable to water, and as solutes molecules are transported out of the proximal convoluted tubule into the interstitial fluid, water moves by osmosis in the same direction. The solutes and water then enter the peritubular capillaries. Consequently, 65% of the filtrate volume is reabsorbed from the proximal convoluted tubule. Next is the descending limb of the loop of Henle, which is this. It is a critical site for water reabsorption, and the wall of the thin segment of the descending limb is highly permeable to water, and yet another 15% of the filtrate is reabsorbed in the descending limb of the loop of Henle. Meanwhile, the descending limb of the loop of Henle dilutes the filtrate by removing solutes. The thin segment of the descending limb is not permeable to water, but it is permeable to solutes. Meanwhile, the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle is not permeable to water, and as a result, sodium, potassium, and chloride, but little water, are removed from the filtrate. Because of the efficient removal of these solutes, the highly concentrated filtrate that enters the ascending limb of the loop of Henle is converted to a dilute solution by the time it reaches the distal convoluted tubule. Also, because of the volume of filtrate reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule and the descending limb of the loop of Henle, only about 20% of the original filtrate volume remains. Let's proceed to the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, which are responsible for the reabsorption of sodium, calcium, magnesium, and water also. In the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, additional sodium and chloride are removed, and water moves out by osmosis, and the filtrate volume is reduced by another 19%, leaving 1% of the original filtrate volume as urine. Moving on to the last step of urine formation, which is the tubular secretion. Tubular secretion involves the peritubular capillary network, which are the blood vessels, as well as the distal convoluted tubule, which we know now as part of the nephron. Tubular secretion is the transfer of materials from the peritubular capillaries to the renal tubular lumen. And it removes some substances from the blood, and these substances includes byproducts of metabolism that became toxic, high concentration, and drugs or other molecules not normally produced by the body. Tubular secretion occurs through either active or passive mechanism. Now, we now have filtrate traveling into the distal convoluted tubule. In this last step, the blood found in the peritubular capillary will actively secrete hydrogen ion, creatinine, and drugs into the distal convoluted tubule. So those substances will move out of the blood into the distal convoluted tubule and join the filtrate already traveling in that tubule. At this point, the filtrate formed is urine. Please note that the tubular secretion is known to happen all along the nephron, but particularly between the peritubular capillary and the DCT.
Now let's study about the regulation of urine concentration and volume. Volume and composition of urine changes depending on the condition of the body. When body fluid concentration increases, the increased water absorption results in a small volume of concentrated urine. This eliminates solutes and conserves water, both of which help lower the body fluid concentration back to normal. On the other hand, when the body fluid concentration decreases, the decreased water absorption results in a large volume of dilute urine. As a result, water is lost, solutes are conserved, and body fluid concentration increases.
Urine production also affects blood volume. Blood volume in turn affects blood pressure. An increase in blood volume also increases blood pressure, while a decrease in blood volume also decreases blood pressure. When blood volume increases above normal, the kidneys produce a large volume of urine. The loss of water in the urine lowers blood volume and blood pressure, while if blood volume decreases below normal, the kidneys produce a small volume of urine, which increases blood volume and blood pressure. Now, let's proceed to the hormonal mechanisms. There are three major hormonal mechanisms that are involved in regulating urine concentration and volume. First is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism, then the antidiuretic hormone or ADH mechanism, and lastly the atrial natriuretic hormone or ANH, atrial natriuretic peptide or ANP mechanism. Each mechanism is activated by different stimuli, but they work together to achieve homeostasis. Both the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism and the ANH mechanism are more sensitive to changes in blood pressure, while ADH mechanism is more sensitive to changes in blood concentration. Renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. The renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism is initiated under low blood pressure condition. When blood pressure decreases, cells of the juxtaglomerular apparatuses in the kidney secrete the enzyme renin. This pathway involves an enzymatic cascade starting with plasma protein produced by the liver called angiotensinogen. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensin 1 is rapidly converted to the active hormone angiotensin 2 by angiotensin-converting enzyme or ACE. Angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone. Aldosterone stimulates an increase in the reabsorption rate of sodium ion and chloride ion in the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts. In this picture, low blood pressure stimulates renin secretion from the kidney. Renin stimulates the production of angiotensin 1, which is converted to angiotensin 2, which in turn stimulates aldosterone secretion from the adrenal cortex. Aldosterone increases sodium ion and water absorption in the kidney. Next is the antidiuretic hormone mechanism. The antidiuretic hormone mechanism is stimulated by a high blood solute concentration. Antidiuretic hormone or ADH increases the permeability of the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts to water. As a result, more water is reabsorbed from the filtrate and the kidneys produce a small volume of concentrated urine. On the other hand, low ADH levels decrease urine volume. The release of ADH from the posterior pituitary is regulated by the hypothalamus. ADH-producing neurons in the hypothalamus are sensitive to changes in solute concentration. Increased solute concentration of the blood triggers action potential in the ADH-secreting neurons, which stimulates the secretion of ADH from their axon terminals located in the posterior pituitary. Reduced solute concentration of the blood inhibits ADH secretion. ADH secretion is also regulated by changes in blood pressure. When baroreceptors that monitor blood pressure detect a significant decrease in blood pressure, ADH secretion increases. When baroreceptors detect a large increase in blood pressure, ADH secretion decreases. However, ADH is more sensitive to changes in blood osmolarity than to blood pressure. In this picture, it shows an increased blood solute concentration affects hypothalamic neurons and decreased blood pressure affects baroreceptors. As a result of this stimuli, the posterior pituitary secretes ADH, which increases water reabsorption by the kidney. And lastly, the atrial natriuretic hormone. An increased blood pressure triggers the atrial natriuretic hormone or ANH mechanism. NAH is secreted from cardiac muscle cells in the right atrium of the heart when blood pressure in the right atrium increases above normal. ANH acts on the kidney to decrease sodium ion reabsorption. Therefore, sodium ion remains in the nephron. Water moves by osmosis in the nephron towards the sodium ion. This increases urine volume while reducing blood volume and blood pressure. In this picture, it shows the increased blood pressure in the right atrium of the heart causes increased secretion of ANH, which increases sodium ion accretion and water loss in the form of urine.
Urine movement. Anatomy and histology of the ureters, urinary bladder, and the urethra. The urinary system are composed of two kidneys, the ureter, the bladder, the prostate, and the urethra. Ureters are small tubes that carry urine from the renal pelvis of kidney to bladder. Urinary bladder. located at the pelvic cavity, which stores urine that can hold a few ml to a maximum of 1000 milliliters. Now, the cystitis is an inflammation of urinary bladder, which usually results from a bacterial infection. Typically, bacteria from the outside of the body enter the bladder. Infection from the bacterium E. coli is most commonly cause of cystitis. Urethra is a tube that carries urine from the urinary bladder to the outside of the body. A triangle portion of the urinary bladder located at the opening of the ureters and the opening of the urethra called the trigon or the triangle. Females has a shorter urethra than males. And now let's discuss the micturition reflex. Micturition reflex are activated by stretch of the urinary bladder wall. Action potentials are conducted from bladder to spinal cord through pelvic nerves. Parasympathetic actions potential cause bladder to contract. Stretching of bladder stimulates sensory neurons to inform brain persons need to urinate.
The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the urinary bladder to the sacral region of the spinal cord, and from the sacral region of the spinal cord back to the bladder. It is coordinated by neurons in the spinal cord and can be influenced by signals from the brain. When the urinary bladder becomes stretched, there is an increase in the frequency of action potentials carried from the bladder wall to the sacral region of the spinal cord. In response, parasympathetic neurons from the spinal cord to the bladder are activated, and this causes the smooth muscle on the bladder wall to contract. The sensory signals to the sacral region of the spinal cord also stimulate ascending pathways to the pons and cerebrum, which results in a conscious desire to urinate. If urination is not convenient at the time, the brain sends impulses down the spinal cord to inhibit the micturition reflex. Impulses carried via somatic motor neurons keep the external urinary sphincter contracted, which also prevents urination. When urination is desired, signals from the brain stimulate the micturition reflex. The brain also decreases action potentials in the somatic motor neurons to relax the external urinary sphincter. The micturition reflex involves impulses traveling from the
body fluid compartments. Approximately 60% of the total body weight of an adult male consists of water. Approximately 50% of the total body weight of an adult female is water. This water content of the body is the total body water, and it gets distributed inside cells and outside cells. If we consider the content of the insides of all cells of the body as one compartment, that is the intracellular fluid or the ICF, and all the water outside the cells together forms the extracellular fluid, that's the ECF. And what's between the two? A cell membrane. So the cell membrane is what separates the intracellular fluid from the extracellular fluid. Most of the fluid is inside the cells, that equivalents to 2/3 of the total body water. So the remaining 1/3 would be the extracellular fluid. If we assume an average of 60% of the body weight is total body water, then 40% is the intracellular fluid and 20% is the extracellular fluid. The ECF is further divided into fluid inside vessels and fluid outside vessels. Inside the vessels would be the plasma, outside is the interstitial fluid. The interstitial fluid is a larger being around 3/4 of the ECF, so the plasma is a quarter. Now what's between these two? A capillary membrane. A small portion of extracellular fluid volume is separated by membranes into subcompartments. These subcompartments contain specialized fluid with a composition different from that of the other extracellular fluid. These special fluids includes the aqueous humor and vitreous humor of the eye, cerebrospinal fluid, synovial fluid in the joint cavities, serous fluid in the body cavities, fluid secreted by glands, renal filtrate, urine in the bladder. Composition of the fluid in the body. Intracellular fluid has a similar composition from cell to cell. It contains a relatively high concentration of ions such as potassium, magnesium, phosphate, and sulfate compared to the extracellular fluid. It has a lower concentration of sodium, calcium, chlorine, and bicarbonate than does the extracellular fluid. The concentration of protein in the intracellular fluid is also greater than that in extracellular fluid. Like intracellular fluid, the extracellular fluid has a fairly consistent composition from one area of the body to another. Exchange between fluid compartments. The cell membranes that separate the body fluid compartments are selectively permeable. Water continually passes through them, but ions dissolved in the water do not readily pass through the cell membrane. Water movement is regulated mainly by hydrostatic pressure differences and osmotic differences between the compartments. For example, water moves across the wall of the capillary at the arterial end of the capillary because the blood pressure there is great enough to force fluid into interstitial space. At the venous end of the capillary, the blood pressure is much lower, and fluid returns to the capillary because the osmotic pressure is higher inside the capillary than outside it. Osmosis controls the movement of water between the intracellular and extracellular spaces. For example, if the extracellular concentration of ions increases, water moves by osmosis from cells into extracellular fluid.
I am now going to discuss the regulation of extracellular fluid. Dito dinidiscuss or dinidescribe kung paano nire-regulate ang ating extracellular fluid sa ating body. Homeostasis requires that the intake of substances equals their elimination, meaning water and ions enter the body by ingestion. Excess water and ions exit the body by excretion. The amounts of water and ions entering and leaving the body can vary over the short term. For example, greater quantities of water and ions are lost in the form of perspiration on warm days than on cool days. So, ayun nga, di ba? Kapag tag-init or kapag mainit yung panahon, doon lumalabas yung ating pawis. Kaya doon nasasabi na yung ating amount ng water and ions sa ating katawan ay nagtatagal lamang ng maikling panahon. Gawa nga nun na kapag tayo ay umiihi or pinagpapawisan, lumalabas yung fluid sa ating katawan. Compare naman sa taglamig, katulad ngayon na hindi tayo gaano pinagpapawisan. Diba? Nagsistay lang yung ating fluid sa ating katawan. Okay? Varying amounts of water and ions may be lost in the form of feces. However, over a long period, the total amount of water and ions in the body does not change unless the individual is growing, gaining weight, or losing weight. Regulating the amounts of water and ions in the body involves the coordinated participation of several organ systems. Ayan, dito na nga nakasama ang ating kidney. Isa sa mga importante ang ating skin, liver, and digestive tract na nagpa-play ng ating supporting roles sa ating katawan. There are two mechanisms to help regulate the levels of ions in the extracellular fluid. The first one is thirst regulation, and the second one is the ion concentration regulation. Thirst regulation. Water intake is controlled by neurons in the hypothalamus. collectively called the thirst center. Thirst occurs when blood becomes more concentrated. Drinking a dilute solution decreases the blood concentration. This decreases the sensation of thirst. A sudden drop in the blood pressure, such as during shock, activates the thirst center, triggering the sensation of thirst. Ayan nga, di ba? Kapag tayo ay tumatawa, tumakbo, or na-shock, parang nakaka-feel tayo ng uhaw. Diba? Kasi parang doon na yung ating blood pressure ay nag-drop down. Consumption of water increases the blood volume and allows the blood pressure to return to its normal value. Okay, so when water is consumed, the concentrations of blood ions decreases due to a dilution effect. This causes the sensation of thirst to decrease. Ayun nga, kapag nauuhaw ka, mas mataas ang concentration ng ion sa blood, kaya kailangang i-lower yon through thirst. The thirst regulation increases blood concentration or large decrease in blood pressure. Ion concentration regulation. If the water content or concentration of ions in the extracellular fluid deviates from its normal range, cells cannot control the movement of substances across their cell membranes or the composition of their intracellular fluid. The consequence is abnormal cell function or even cell death. Keeping the extracellular fluid composition within a normal range is therefore required to sustain life. Okay. Regulating the concentrations of positively charged ions. Yung tatlo, yung potassium, calcium, and sodium. It is very important to our body for strength and energy of the body. And now what happened is that action potentials, muscle contraction, and normal cell membrane permeability depend on the maintenance of a narrow range of concentrations for these ions. Important mechanisms control the concentrations of these ions in the body. Sodium ions are the dominant ions in the extracellular fluid. About 90 to 95% of the osmic pressure of the extracellular fluid results from sodium ions and from the negative ions associated with them. So, para saan si sodium ions? Okay, so stimuli that control aldosterone secretion influence the reabsorption of sodium mula sa ating nephrons of the kidney and the total amount of sodium sa mga body fluids. Reabsorption of sodium from the distal convoluted tubules and collecting ducts is very efficient. And little sodium is lost in the urine when aldosterone is present. Sodium ions are also excreted from the body in perspiration or sweat. Normally, only a small quantity of sodium is lost each day in the form of sweat, but the amount of increases during heavy exercise in a warm environment. So yun nga, nabanggit kanina na nawawala ang ating sodium kapag lumalabas yung ating liquid sa katawan. Kasi ang pumapalit naman doon is nandun yung aldosterone. Potassium ion, yan meron din tayo nito sa ating katawan. It electrically excitable tissues such as muscles and nerves are highly sensitive to slight changes in the extracellular potassium concentration. The extracellular concentration of potassium must be maintained within a narrow range for these tissues to function normally. Aldosterone plays a major role in regulating the concentration of potassium in the extracellular fluid. Okay, dehydration, circulatory system shock resulting. Ito yung nagmumula sa pagkawala ng plasma at pagkasira ng tissue dahil sa mga pinsala gaya ng matinding pagkasunog ay nagiging cause ng extracellular potassium concentration to increase above normal. Ayun, parang, yun nga, hindi na nakikita na niyo yung pagka-normal yung extracellular potassium. Okay. A low potassium concentration naman in the extracellular fluid slows aldosterone secretion from the adrenal cortex. Ayun. Kapag wala yung aldosterone, the kidneys decrease their rate of potassium secretion. Calcium ions. The extracellular concentration of calcium, like that of other ions, is maintained within a narrow range. Increases and decreases in the extracellular concentration of calcium have dramatic effects on electrical properties of excitable tissues. Okay, so meron dalawang tumutulong sa calcium ions para mag-regulate dito. Ito yung parathyroid hormone or PTH. It's secreted by the parathyroid glands, increases extracellular calcium concentrations. And yung isa naman is calcitonin. Reduces the blood calcium and concentration when it is too high. We have another extracellular, which is the phosphate and sulfate ions. Some ions, such as phosphate ions and sulfate ions, are absorbed by active transport in the kidneys. The rate of reabsorption is slow, so that if the concentration of these ions in the filtrate exceeds the nephron's ability to reabsorb them, the excess is excreted into the urine. As long as the concentration of these ions is low, nearly all of them are reabsorbed by active transport. Okay, so phosphate and sulfate ions are very important in excretion and reabsorption, also in concentration of other filtrates.
Regulation of acid-base balance. The concentration of hydrogen ion in the body fluids is reported as the pH. The body fluid pH is maintained between 7.35 and 7.45, and any deviation from the range is life-threatening. The pH body of fluids is controlled by three factors: the buffer, the respiratory system, and the kidneys. And when the body fluids is not properly maintained, it will result or lead to acidosis or alkalosis. Buffers. It's a chemicals that resist a change in the pH of the solution when either acids or bases are added to the solution. The buffers in the body fluids contain salts or either weak acids or weak bases that bind to the hydrogen ion. When hydrogen ion increases in those fluids or release hydrogen ion, when hydrogen ion decreases in those fluids, the buffer tend to keep the hydrogen concentration and thus the pH within the narrow range of values. There are three major buffers: the protein, the phosphate buffer system, and the bicarbonate buffer system. The third buffer is the most plentiful. The first is usually considered the most important since it is coupled to the respiratory system. Carbonic acid or H2CO3 is a weak acid and is therefore in equilibrium with bicarbonate in solution. When significant amount of both carbonic acid and bicarbonate are present, a buffer is formed. This buffer system can be written as this. Under normal circumstances, there is much more bicarbonate presence than carbonic acid. As normal metabolism produces more acids than bases, this is consistent with the body's needs. The blood, with its high base concentration, is able to neutralize the metabolic acid produced. Since relatively small amounts of metabolic bases are produced, the bicarbonate acid concentration in the blood can be lower. Since carbonic acid is not stable in aqueous solution, some of it decomposes to form carbon dioxide and water. The respiratory system is responsible for removing the carbon dioxide. By combining the two reactions of carbonic acid, we can write by this. Next is the respiratory system. It contributes to the balance of acids and bases in the body by regulating the blood levels of carbonic acids. Carbon dioxide in the blood readily reacts with water to form carbonic acid, and the levels of carbon dioxide and the carbonic acid in the blood are in equilibrium. Next is the kidneys. There are two main ways to maintain acid-base balance. Their cells reabsorbs bicarbonate from the urine back to the blood, and they secrete hydrogen ions into the urine. By adjusting the amount reabsorbed and secreted, they balance the bloodstream's pH. The failure of buffer system, the respiratory system, or the urinary system to maintain the normal pH level can result in acidosis or alkalosis. Acidosis is caused by overproduction of acids that builds up in the blood or excessive loss of bicarbonate from the blood, or by buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood that result from poor lung function or depressed breathing. When the blood pH falls below 7.35, the individual becomes disoriented and as the condition worsens, may become comatose. There are two categories of acidosis, the respiratory acidosis and metabolic acidosis. Respiratory acidosis. It is buildup of carbon dioxide in the blood that results from poor lung function or depressed breathing. These are the common symptoms of respiratory acidosis. The individual can having a fatigue, confusion, coma, anxiety, headache, shortness of breathing, and sweating. Metabolic acidosis. It's buildup in the blood or an excessive loss of bicarbonate from the blood. The common symptoms of metabolic acidosis are fast heartbeat, headache, not wanting to eat, or vomiting. Alkalosis. It is a condition concerning the pH of your blood and fluids. It occurs when your blood pH levels are imbalance and it's too alkaline. And also, alkalosis occurs when the blood pH increases above 7.45. The major effects of alkalosis is hyperexcitability of the nervous system. The peripheral nerves are affected first, resulting in spontaneous nervous stimulation of muscles. Spasms and tetanic contraction result, as can extreme nervousness or convulsions. Tetany of the respiratory muscles can cause death. There are two categories of alkalosis, the respiratory alkalosis and metabolic alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis is a disturbance in the acid and base balance due to alveolar hyperventilation, and also it can be acute or chronic. Some of the symptoms of respiratory alkalosis are discomfort in the chest area, confusion, dry mouth, and tingling in the arms. Metabolic alkalosis. It occurs when the digestive issue disrupts the blood's acid-base balance. It can also be due to condition affecting the liver, kidney, or heart. Metabolic alkalosis is usually not life-threatening. The cause of metabolic alkalosis by too much bicarbonate in the blood. Some of the symptoms of metabolic alkalosis are tremor, seizure, coma, and fatigue. So that's all for today. We hope that you learned a lot about regulation of acid-base balance. Thank you for watching and see you on our next video. Bye!